In February of 1897, a British naval officer stood in the throne room of an African king and made a decision that would echo through history for more than a century. The room around him was filled with treasures so magnificent, so impossibly detailed, that he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Bronze plaques lined the walls, each one depicting scenes of such artistry and sophistication that they seemed to belong in the finest museums of Europe. Ivory tusks, carved with intricate patterns, reached toward the ceiling. Gold ornaments caught the light from doorways, and everywhere he looked, there was art that challenged everything he thought he knew about Africa. The officer's name has been lost to the margins of history, but his actions that day, and the actions of the thousands of British soldiers who followed him into that palace, would become one of the most controversial chapters in the story of colonialism. Because what happened next wasn't just theft, it was the systematic looting of an entire civilization's memory, the erasure of a people's right to tell their own story. And the objects they took, objects we now call the Benin bronzes, would spend the next 125 years at the center of one of the most important debates in the modern world. Who owns history? Who has the right to tell it? And when something precious is stolen, what does justice actually look like? This is the story of an artifact, yes, but it's also the story of a kingdom that refused to be forgotten, a nation that built itself back from ashes, and a global movement that's forcing museums around the world to confront an uncomfortable truth. The things they've been displaying as symbols of human achievement, the very objects that draw millions of visitors through their doors each year, might actually be the spoils of war, the proceeds of crimes that were never answered for. And at the heart of this story is a question that matters more today than ever before. What happens when the colonized finally get to speak? Let's start where every good story should start. Not at the beginning, but at the moment when everything changed. Picture London in the winter of 1897. The British Empire is at its zenith, stretching across a quarter of the Earth's surface, controlling the lives of 400 million people. In the grand halls of the British Museum, curators are cataloging treasures from around the world, each piece a testament to Britain's global reach, each artifact a symbol of superiority. And then, in the spring of that year, something arrives that doesn't fit the narrative at all. Crates begin appearing at the museum's loading docks, shipped from West Africa, from a place most Londoners have never heard of, called Benin City. When the curators pry open these crates, when they lift out the objects packed in straw and cloth, they find themselves staring at something impossible. Bronze plaques of such technical mastery that some of them immediately assume they can't be African at all. The detail is too fine, the casting too perfect, the artistic vision too sophisticated. Surely, they think, these must have been made by Europeans, or perhaps by Egyptians, or maybe they're evidence of some lost civilization that once ruled Africa before the current inhabitants arrived. This reaction tells you everything you need to know about the mindset of that era. These curators, these educated men who pride themselves on their knowledge of world culture, literally cannot accept that black Africans could have created art of this caliber. And so they invent stories, theories, wild speculations about Phoenician traders or Portuguese influence, anything to avoid the obvious truth staring them in the face. But here's what makes this moment so tragically ironic. While these men in London are debating the origins of the bronzes, trying to explain away African genius, back in West Africa, the city that created them is burning. The palaces that once held these treasures are being torn apart. The artists who knew the ancient techniques of bronze casting are being scattered. The libraries of oral history, the genealogies and stories passed down through generations are being disrupted. And the kingdom itself, a kingdom that had existed for over 600 years, is being forcibly absorbed into the British Empire. The Benin bronzes didn't arrive in London as gifts or purchases. They arrived as loot from a punitive expedition, spoils of a colonial war, and the story of how they got there is darker than most museums would like to admit. But to understand why this matters, why people are still fighting over these objects more than a century later, we need to go back further. We need to understand what Benin was before the British came, what they destroyed, and why these bronzes represent something far more important than just beautiful art. So let's rewind the clock, not just decades, but centuries, to a time when Europe was emerging from medieval darkness and a kingdom in West Africa was already building one of the most sophisticated civilizations on the continent. The Kingdom of Benin, and we need to be clear here, this is not the modern country of Benin which lies to the west. This was a kingdom centered in what is now southern Nigeria, and it was unlike anything most European visitors had ever seen. When Portuguese explorers first made contact in the late 1400s, they found a city surrounded by massive earthen walls that stretched for miles. Walls that some historians believe required more material to build than the Great Pyramid of Giza. They found wide boulevards, organized districts, and a royal palace complex so vast that it took hours to walk through. They found a society with a sophisticated political system, a complex religious life, guilds of specialized craftsmen, and an artistic tradition that had been refined over centuries.
The Benin bronzes, which aren't actually all bronze, some are brass, some are ivory, some are wood, were created by these guild craftsmen, particularly the Igun Eranman, the guild of bronze casters who served the Oba, the divine king of Benin. These artists had perfected the lost wax casting method, a technique so difficult that even today, modern sculptures struggle to replicate it. They would carve intricate designs in wax, cover the wax in clay to make a mold, heat the mold until the wax melted away, and then pour molten metal into the resulting cavity. The precision required was extraordinary. One mistake, one air bubble, one miscalculation of temperature, and months of work would be ruined. Yet these artists produced thousands of plaques, heads, sculptures, and ornaments, each one unique, each one a masterpiece. And these weren't just decorative objects, they were historical records, visual archives that documented the kingdom's history, its ceremonies, its relationships with other nations. When you looked at the walls of the Oba's palace covered in these bronze plaques, you were looking at the kingdom's memory, cast in metal, designed to last forever. The kingdom thrived for centuries on trade, first in pepper and ivory, later in palm oil and other commodities, and yes, tragically, also in enslaved people, a fact we cannot and should not ignore. Benin was not a utopia. It was a complex society with its own internal hierarchies, its own conflicts, its own moral failings, but it was also a sovereign state with its own culture, its own systems of governance, its own artistic achievements. And when European powers began carving up Africa in the late 1800s, when the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 85 divided the continent among European nations without a single African leader in the room, Benin found itself in the crosshairs of British imperial ambition. The British wanted control of the palm oil trade. They wanted to establish protectorates and colonies, and the Oba of Benin, Oba Ovonramwen, was standing in their way. He insisted on maintaining Benin's independence, on controlling trade on his own terms. And in the brutal logic of empire, this made him a problem that needed to be solved. The pretext for invasion came in January of 1897, when a British delegation led by Acting Consul General James Phillips decided to visit Benin City during a sacred period when the Oba had requested no visitors. The exact details of what happened next are disputed, contested, argued over by historians with different perspectives. What we know is that Phillips and most of his party were killed in an ambush. Whether this was ordered by the Oba, whether it was the action of subordinate chiefs, whether it was a defensive response to what was perceived as a hostile incursion, these questions remain debated. But the British response was not debatable. It was swift, massive, and devastating. Within weeks, a punitive expedition of 1,500 British troops, armed with machine guns and cannons, descended on Benin City. The kingdom's warriors, armed with traditional weapons, never stood a chance. The city fell quickly, and what happened next was systematic destruction. British forces set fire to the city, burning it for days. They killed defenders and civilians alike. They destroyed temples and sacred sites, and most relevantly for our story, they looted everything of value they could find. Officers and soldiers walked through the palace complex, filling bags and crates with bronze plaques, ivory tusks, carved figures, ceremonial objects, anything that looked valuable or interesting. Some of these objects were considered personal souvenirs. Others were officially seized as spoils of war. Many were later sold at auction in London to help pay for the cost of the expedition, a grotesque accounting where the cost of destroying a civilization was offset by selling its treasures. The Oba himself was captured, tried in a British court without any resemblance to due process, and exiled, where he would die a few years later, far from the kingdom he had ruled. And just like that, 600 years of history came to an end. The Kingdom of Benin was absorbed into the British Protectorate of southern Nigeria, and the objects that had documented its history were scattered across Europe, ending up in museums, private collections, and auction houses from London to Berlin, from Vienna to New York. Now here's where the story gets complicated, because for decades, most people didn't know or didn't care about any of this. The Benin bronzes became celebrated masterpieces of African art, displayed prominently in major museums, studied by art historians, admired by millions of visitors. Museums framed them as treasures of human civilization that they were preserving for the world, protecting from potential destruction or loss. The story of how they were acquired was often glossed over, mentioned in small text on wall plaques, if mentioned at all, reduced to bland phrases like acquired during the Benin expedition of 1897, that made it sound like a diplomatic mission rather than a military assault. And for a long time, this narrative went largely unchallenged in the West, because the people whose story these objects told, the descendants of the Kingdom of Benin, didn't have the political power or international platform to challenge it. Colonial rule continued in Nigeria until 1960, when the country finally gained independence. But even after independence, even as Nigeria became a sovereign nation, the bronzes remained in foreign museums, and the requests for their return were met with bureaucratic silence or outright rejection.
Museums offered a variety of arguments for keeping the bronzes, and it's worth examining these arguments carefully because they reveal a lot about how cultural institutions think about ownership and legacy. Some said the objects were legally acquired, purchased at auction, or obtained through official channels, conveniently ignoring that those auctions were selling stolen goods, and those official channels were instruments of colonial occupation. Others argued that the museums had preserved these objects, that if they had remained in Africa, they might have been lost to conflict, decay, or neglect, an argument that infantilizes an entire continent and ignores the fact that these objects survived for centuries before Europeans arrived. Still others claimed that great museums serve a universal mission, that important artifacts should be accessible to all humanity, not locked away in one country, an argument that sounds noble until you realize it only ever seems to apply to artifacts taken from Africa, Asia, and Latin America, never to European treasures. And some, more honestly but no less problematically, simply said that possession is 9/10 of the law, that the past cannot be undone, that we can't return everything to everywhere it came from or museums would be empty. Each of these arguments has a certain surface logic, and if you're sitting in London or Berlin and New York, they might even seem reasonable. But if you're sitting in Benin City, if your great-great-grandfather was one of the bronze casters whose life's work was stolen, if you walk past empty palace walls that once held your history, these arguments sound very different. They sound like excuses. They sound like the powerful finding reasons to keep what they took from the powerless. For decades, this is where the story sat, frozen in bureaucratic inertia, with occasional requests for return politely declined and the bronzes remaining in Western museums. But something started to change in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The post-colonial world was finding its voice.
Countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America were no longer willing to accept the narratives written by their former colonizers. A new generation of scholars, activists, and museum professionals began asking uncomfortable questions about the provenance of objects in Western collections. The internet made it harder for museums to control the narrative, harder to keep the full history of acquisitions hidden in archives that only specialists could access. Social movements demanding racial justice and decolonization brought new attention to colonial legacies. And importantly, Nigeria itself was changing. Despite challenges, despite corruption and conflict, the country was building institutions, developing infrastructure, creating museums and cultural centers that could preserve and display its own heritage. The argument that Nigeria couldn't properly care for returned artifacts was looking increasingly hollow and increasingly racist.
The turning point came in 2007 when a group of Nigerian officials, including representatives from the Oba's court, made a formal request to the British Museum for the return of the bronzes. This wasn't the first such request, but it came at a moment when the conversation around colonial artifacts was shifting. The British Museum's response was telling. They acknowledged the importance of the bronzes to Nigerian culture. They expressed sympathy for the desire to have them returned, and then they said no. They cited the British Museum Act of 1963, which prohibits the museum from permanently removing objects from its collection, except in very limited circumstances. It was a legal answer to a moral question, a bureaucratic shield against an ethical demand. But here's the thing about shields. Eventually, someone finds a way around them. In the years that followed, activists and advocates tried a different approach. If museums wouldn't return the bronzes permanently, what about loans? What about digital repatriation, creating high-quality replicas and 3D scans? What about collaborative exhibitions where objects would be displayed in both Nigeria and Western museums? These creative solutions got some traction, but they also revealed the fundamental problem. Nigeria didn't want to borrow its own heritage. It didn't want replicas of its own art. It wanted the actual objects back, permanently, unconditionally, because anything less than that perpetuated the colonial relationship where the West decided what Africa was allowed to have. The pressure continued to build through the 2010s, and then something happened that changed everything. In 2017, French President Emmanuel Macron gave a speech at the University of Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso, where he made a stunning announcement. He said that the permanent return of African heritage to Africa must be a priority, and he commissioned a report on how France could return artifacts taken during the colonial period. When that report was published a year later, it recommended the return of thousands of objects, and suddenly the conversation shifted. If France, with its vast colonial history and massive museum collections, was willing to consider returns, then other European nations were going to face pressure to do the same. In 2019, the Quai Branly Museum in Paris returned 26 objects to Benin, the modern country, not items from the Benin bronzes, but other artifacts taken during French colonialism. It was a symbolic victory, proof that return was possible, that museums wouldn't collapse if they acknowledged the troubled origins of their collections. And then in 2020, everything accelerated. The death of George Floyd and the global protests that followed brought a new urgency to conversations about racism, inequality, and historical injustice. Statues of colonial figures were being toppled in cities across Europe and America. Institutions were being forced to reckon with their complicity in systems of oppression. And museums, those supposedly neutral temples of culture and learning, were suddenly being seen for what they often are: institutions that reflect and reinforce power structures. The Black Lives Matter movement didn't focus specifically on museum collections, but it created a cultural moment where questions about who gets to tell history and whose stories get elevated became impossible to ignore. And in that moment, the arguments for keeping the Benin bronzes started to sound not just outdated, but actively harmful, a continuation of colonial violence by other means. Museum directors found themselves facing protests, staff rebellions, and donor pressure. Newspaper editorials called for returns. Documentaries and podcasts brought the story to wider audiences. And crucially, Nigeria itself was ready.
In 2020, the Edo Museum of West African Art was announced, a new institution being built in Benin City, designed by Ghanaian-British architect David Ajayi, funded by international partnerships, specifically intended to house returned artifacts and tell the story of Benin from a Nigerian perspective. And then the dominoes started to fall. In 2021, Germany announced it would return all of its Benin bronzes, more than 1,000 objects held in museums across the country. In 2022, the Smithsonian Institution in Washington announced it would return its bronzes. The University of Cambridge, the University of Oxford, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York all made similar announcements. Even the British Museum, which had held firm for so long behind its legal protections, began to shift its position, discussing long-term loans, acknowledging the troubled history, exploring legal mechanisms that might allow for some form of return. By late 2023 and into 2024, objects were actually moving. Ceremonies were being held in Benin City as bronzes came home, and the landscape of the debate had completely changed. The question was no longer whether to return the bronzes, but how quickly it could be done and what lessons could be learned for other colonial collections. But here's where we need to slow down and think carefully about what this all means, because the story of the Benin bronzes isn't just about one collection of objects or one historical wrong. It's a case study in a much larger global reckoning, and the questions it raises don't have simple answers. Let's start with the most fundamental question. Why does this matter? These are, after all, just objects. They've been in Western museums for a century. Multiple generations have grown up seeing them there. They've been studied, preserved, and appreciated by millions of people. Nigeria is a developing country with enormous challenges: poverty, corruption, infrastructure problems. Why should returning some old bronze plaques be a priority when there is so many more urgent issues? This question, which you hear sometimes from skeptics, misses something essential about what artifacts like the Benin bronzes represent. These aren't just decorative objects or historical curiosities. They are embodiments of memory, physical manifestations of a people's story about themselves. When the British burned Benin City and scattered its treasures, they weren't just committing an act of military aggression, they were attempting something more insidious: the erasure of a civilization's ability to tell its own story.
During French colonialism, it was a symbolic victory, proof that return was possible, that museums wouldn't collapse if they acknowledged the troubled origins of their collections. And then, in 2020, everything accelerated. The death of George Floyd and the global protests that followed brought new urgency to conversations about racism, inequality, and historical injustice. Statues of colonial figures were being toppled in cities across Europe and America. Institutions were being forced to reckon with their complicity in systems of oppression. And museums, those supposedly neutral temples of culture and learning, were suddenly being seen for what they often are: institutions that reflect and reinforce power structures. The Black Lives Matter movement didn't focus specifically on museum collections, but it created a cultural moment where questions about who gets to tell history and whose stories get elevated became impossible to ignore. And in that moment, the arguments for keeping the Benin bronzes started to sound not just outdated, but actively harmful, a continuation of colonial violence by other means. Museum directors found themselves facing protests, staff rebellions, and donor pressure. Newspaper editorials called for returns. Documentaries and podcasts brought the story to wider audiences. And crucially, Nigeria itself was ready. In 2020, the Edo Museum of West African Art was announced, a new institution being built in Benin City, designed by Ghanaian-British architect David Ajayi, funded by international partnerships, specifically intended to house returned artifacts and tell the story of Benin from a Nigerian perspective.
And then the dominoes started to fall. In 2021, Germany announced it would return all of its Benin bronzes, more than 1,000 objects held in museums across the country. In 2022, the Smithsonian Institution in Washington announced it would return its bronzes. The University of Cambridge, the University of Oxford, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York all made similar announcements. Even the British Museum, which had held firm for so long behind its legal protections, began to shift its position, discussing long-term loans, acknowledging the troubled history, exploring legal mechanisms that might allow for some form of return. By late 2023 and into 2024, objects were actually moving. Ceremonies were being held in Benin City as bronzes came home, and the landscape of the debate had completely changed. The question was no longer whether to return the bronzes, but how quickly it could be done, and what lessons could be learned for other colonial collections. But here's where we need to slow down and think carefully about what this all means, because the story of the Benin bronzes isn't just about one collection of objects or one historical wrong. It's a case study in a much larger global reckoning, and the questions it raises don't have simple answers. Let's start with the most fundamental question. Why does this matter? These are, after all, just objects. They've been in Western museums for over a century. Multiple generations have grown up seeing them there. They've been studied, preserved, and appreciated by millions of people. Nigeria is a developing country with enormous challenges. Poverty, corruption, infrastructure problems. Why should returning some old bronze plaques be a priority when there are so many more urgent issues? This question, which you hear sometimes from skeptics, misses something essential about what artifacts like the Benin bronzes represent. These aren't just decorative objects or historical curiosities. They are embodiments of memory, physical manifestations of a people's story about themselves. When the British burned Benin City and scattered its treasures, they weren't just committing an act of military aggression. They were attempting something more insidious, the erasure of a civilization's ability to tell its own story. In many cultures, particularly oral cultures where knowledge is passed down through storytelling, objects serve as anchors for memory. You don't just look at a bronze plaque and see a beautiful piece of art. You see the story it depicts. You remember the history it represents. You connect with the ancestors who created it. When those objects are taken away, when they're sitting in museums 8,000 kilometers from home, interpreted by foreign scholars, viewed by foreign audiences, labeled with descriptions written from a foreign perspective, something profound is lost. The people who should be the protagonists of their own history become footnotes in someone else's story. Their achievements are admired, but also implicitly claimed by the institutions that hold them. The narrative becomes, look what we have preserved, rather than look what they created. And for post-colonial nations still building their identities, still working to overcome the psychological damage of being told for generations that their cultures were primitive and inferior, the return of these objects has enormous symbolic and practical importance. It's about dignity. It's about sovereignty. It's about having the right to decide how your own story is told. But the symbolism goes deeper still, because the Benin bronzes represent a very specific kind of colonial violence. This wasn't accidental loss or gradual erosion. This was systematic, intentional looting carried out as collective punishment after a military conquest. The objects were taken precisely because they were valuable, because they represented the wealth and power of the kingdom, and removing them was a way of humiliating and dominating the defeated people. And then those same objects were used to finance the very expedition that destroyed the kingdom. A perverse economic cycle where the spoils of colonial violence paid for colonial violence. When museums today display these objects without fully acknowledging this history, without grappling with the moral implications, they're not just showing art, they're displaying the proceeds of a crime and asking viewers to admire them. It's as if a museum acquired paintings from a bank heist and then framed them as a celebration of artistic genius without mentioning where they came from. The beauty of the object doesn't erase the ugliness of their acquisition. If anything, it makes it worse, because it allows institutions to benefit from colonial violence while maintaining a veneer of cultural sophistication. Now, defenders of the current system, and there are many, even among people who consider themselves progressive, often make what seems like a reasonable argument. They say that major museums serve a universal mission, that they make art and culture accessible to global audiences, that a child in London or Berlin or New York should be able to see masterpieces from around the world without having to travel to their countries of origin. And they have a point. There is something valuable about institutions that bring together objects from many cultures, that facilitate cross-cultural understanding, that allow people to see the breadth of human creativity. The problem is that this argument is built on a foundation that's fundamentally unequal. Western museums get to hold treasures from all over the world, but African museums don't get to hold European masterpieces. The British Museum has Egyptian mummies, Greek sculptures, Nigerian bronzes, but Nigerian museums don't have British crown jewels and Shakespeare's manuscripts. The universalism only flows in one direction, from the formerly colonized to the former colonizers. And when you point this out, when you note that the British Museum's collection is largely a map of British imperial expansion, the response is often that Britain has better preservation resources, more visitors, more established institutions. But that's just circular reasoning. Britain has those resources partly because of the wealth extracted during colonialism, and museums remain underfunded in many African countries partly because of the economic legacy of colonial exploitation. You can't use the consequences of an injustice to justify perpetuating that injustice.
There's another argument you hear sometimes, more cynically but more honestly. Some say that repatriation claims are politically motivated, that they're tools for nationalist governments to build domestic support, that corrupt leaders would rather score points by demanding artifacts back than actually solve their country's problems. And yes, there's truth to the idea that repatriation can be politicized. There's truth to the concern that returned artifacts might not always be perfectly preserved or made accessible. But this argument reveals an interesting double standard. Western museums are allowed to be imperfect, to have storage rooms full of objects never displayed, to have troubled acquisition histories, to be funded by ethically questionable donors, and we still consider them legitimate institutions. But African museums are held to an impossible standard where any hint of imperfection becomes an excuse to deny repatriation. It's the same paternalistic logic that justified colonialism in the first place. The idea that Europeans know better, that they're more responsible, that Africans can't be trusted with their own heritage. And it ignores the central point that ownership isn't conditional on being perfect. Your right to your own property doesn't disappear because someone thinks they could take better care of it. Let's dig into another complex issue that doesn't get discussed enough. What exactly does return mean? And who should receive the returned objects? This might seem straightforward, but it's actually quite complicated. The Kingdom of Benin no longer exists as a political entity. It was absorbed into colonial Nigeria, and modern Nigeria is a complex federal democracy with over 200 ethnic groups. The royal family of Benin still exists, the current Oba still holds traditional authority, but he's not a head of state. He's a cultural and traditional leader within a modern nation. So when Germany says it's returning bronzes to Nigeria, is that the right approach? Or should they be returned specifically to the Royal Court of Benin, or to Edo State where Benin City is located, or to institutions that represent the broader Nigerian nation? Different groups have different answers, and those answers reflect different visions of identity and authority. Some argue that the Oba's palace is the rightful home, since that's where the objects came from, that they're sacred objects with specific cultural and religious significance that shouldn't be treated as mere art. Others argue that they should belong to the Nigerian people as a whole, displayed in museums where all Nigerians and international visitors can see them, studied by scholars, used for education. This isn't an abstract debate. It has real implications for how returned objects will be used, who will control access to them, how they'll be interpreted and displayed. The solution that's emerging is a kind of shared custody. The The new Edo Museum of West African Art will house many returned objects, but the Obas Palace will also receive some pieces, and there will be coordination with the National Museum in Lagos and other Nigerian institutions. It's a compromise that tries to honor both the traditional ownership and the modern institutional needs, but it also reveals something important. Return isn't a simple reversal that takes us back to some pristine pre-colonial state. You can't undo the 20th century. The Benin bronzes have been studied, photographed, cataloged, discussed in scholarly literature for over 100 years. They've influenced Western art, inspired artists, been part of a global conversation about African achievement. That history can't be erased either. What return actually means is a rebalancing of power and authority, a recognition that the people whose ancestors created these objects should have the primary say in what happens to them. But within a modern context where museums, scholarship, and cultural exchange are all valued. This brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of the whole story. What's happened to the Western museums that have decided to return the bronzes? Did they collapse? Did their collections become meaningless? Did visitors stop coming? No. In many cases, the opposite has happened. Museums that have grappled seriously with the colonial origins of their collections, that have been transparent about troubled provenance, that have engaged in genuine dialogue with source communities, have often found that it deepens rather than diminishes their relevance. Visitors, especially younger visitors, want honesty. They want institutions that acknowledge complexity and complicity. They're more interested in museums that ask difficult questions than museums that present seamless narratives of cultural progress. The decision to return the Benin bronzes has prompted exhibitions about colonialism, about repatriation, about the ethics of collecting. It's forced museums to examine their entire collections with fresh eyes, to research acquisition histories more carefully, to build relationships with communities around the world. Far from being a loss, it's been an opportunity for reinvention. Museums that return objects can still display replicas, can create exhibitions about the return process itself, can partner with Nigerian institutions to create shared programming. The story of the bronzes becomes richer, more nuanced, more educational when you acknowledge the full history.
And there's a deeper lesson here about power and knowledge. For most of their time in Western museums, the Benin bronzes were interpreted entirely by Western scholars. European and American art historians wrote the books, curated the exhibitions, trained the next generation of experts. Nigerian voices were largely absent from this conversation, or present only in marginal ways. The objects were studied through Western frameworks, described using Western aesthetic categories, fitted into Western narratives of art history. Now, as the objects return, as Nigerian scholars and curators take leading roles in studying and displaying them, we're going to learn new things about the bronzes. Because the people studying them will bring different questions, different knowledge systems, different cultural contexts. They'll know oral histories that aren't written down, understand symbolic meanings that Western scholars missed, see connections that require intimate cultural knowledge. This is what repatriation really offers, not just the physical return of objects, but the decolonization of knowledge itself. The recognition that the people who created something are often best positioned to interpret it. But let's not romanticize this process, because repatriation also raises genuinely difficult questions that don't have easy answers. One of the most challenging is what legal scholar Kwame Anthony Appiah calls the cosmopolitan question. He argues, in essence, that great works of art belong to all of humanity, that while we should acknowledge and honor the specific cultural origins of objects, we should also recognize their universal value. In this view, the Benin bronzes aren't just Nigerian heritage, they're human heritage, and dispersing them in museums around the world allows them to speak to more people, to facilitate more cross-cultural dialogue. Appiah, who is Ghanaian British, isn't defending colonialism or theft. He's asking a deeper question about whether national ownership is the right framework for thinking about cultural heritage. And it's a question worth taking seriously. There is something valuable about being able to see art from many cultures in one place, about the kind of connections and comparisons that become possible when objects are juxtaposed, about making world culture accessible to people who can't travel internationally.
The problem is that this cosmopolitan ideal has only ever been achieved through the mechanism of colonial appropriation. The great universal museums are universal because European empires took things from everywhere. And as long as the objects remain in Europe and North America, as long as the interpretation and control remains in Western hands, the universalism is really just imperialism with better marketing. So how do we achieve genuine cosmopolitanism, genuine global access to cultural heritage without reproducing colonial patterns? This is where technology offers some interesting possibilities. High-quality 3D scanning, virtual reality, digital museums. These technologies could theoretically allow people anywhere in the world to experience artifacts from anywhere else. You could have the actual objects in Nigeria and digital replicas in museums worldwide. You could have virtual exhibitions that bring together objects that are physically thousands of miles apart. You could create educational resources that are accessible to anyone with internet access. But here's the catch. Technology isn't neutral. Right now, the institutions with the most advanced scanning equipment, the most sophisticated digital infrastructure, the most resources for creating high-quality virtual experiences are still mostly in the West. If we're not careful, digital repatriation could become a way of keeping physical objects in Western museums while offering digital scraps to source communities. The promise of technology to democratize access to culture requires genuine commitment to equity, which means investing in infrastructure and capacity building in countries that have historically been excluded from these conversations. It means ensuring that Nigerian museums have the same tools and resources as British or German museums. It means recognizing that true universalism requires material equality, not just good intentions.
There's another dimension to all of this that we need to address head-on, which is that the Benin bronzes are just the tip of the iceberg. Museums around the world hold millions of objects taken during colonial periods, and many of those objects have even more complicated histories than the bronzes. At least with the Benin bronzes, there's a clear moment of acquisition, a specific military action that most people agree was wrong. But what about objects that were purchased from people who were living under colonial rule and may not have had genuine freedom to refuse the sale? What about objects taken from cultures that no longer exist, that were wiped out by disease or violence, where there are no clear descendant communities to return things to? What about objects that have been mixed and remixed, that incorporate materials and techniques from multiple cultures, that have moved through so many hands that tracing provenance is nearly impossible? What about human remains, which many museums still hold, often obtained in deeply troubling ways, sometimes from people who were killed specifically so their bodies could be studied? These questions don't have simple answers, and the return of the Benin bronzes, while hugely significant, doesn't provide a template that works for every case. What it does do is establish some principles. It says that when the history of acquisition is clearly violent and unjust, return should be the default, not something museums resist at every turn. It says that legal technicalities shouldn't be used to avoid moral obligations. It says that the voices of source communities should be centered in these discussions, not treated as one input among many. It says that museums need to be proactive, not waiting for demands, but actively researching their collections, reaching out to communities, being transparent about what they hold and how they got it. And perhaps most importantly, it says that we can't let the complexity of some cases become an excuse for inaction on cases that are actually pretty straightforward. The fact that there are difficult edge cases doesn't mean we should fail to address the clear injustices. The Benin bronzes are a clear case. They were taken by force in a military action that served no defensive purpose. The descendant community is identifiable and ready to receive them. There's no legitimate dispute about where they came from or who created them. If we can't return objects under those circumstances, then the whole framework of repatriation is meaningless. Let's talk about what's happening right now, today, as these returns actually occur, because the story doesn't end with museums agreeing to give things back.
In Benin City, the Edo Museum of West African Art is under construction, a striking building that will be one of the first institutions in Africa designed specifically to international museum standards, while also honoring local architectural traditions. The building process itself has been collaborative, involving Nigerian and international architects, conservation experts, community leaders. The goal is to create a space that can preserve returned objects to the highest standards while also serving as a cultural center for the community, a place where history is taught, where artists can work, where the story of Benin is told by the people of Benin. Some of the returned bronzes have already arrived, and the ceremonies around these returns have been deeply moving. Traditional chiefs in elaborate regalia, palace officials performing rituals, crowds of local people coming to see objects their ancestors created, objects many of them have only seen in photographs or not seen at all. There's joy in these moments, pride, a sense of restoration that goes beyond the physical objects to touch something deep about identity and dignity. But there's also a recognition of loss, because these objects spent 125 years away. Multiple generations grew up without access to them, without the ability to pass on the knowledge associated with them, without seeing daily reminders of their civilization's achievements. The trauma of that loss doesn't vanish just because the objects return. Some of the techniques used to create the bronzes were lost or disrupted. Oral histories that would have been passed down alongside the objects were broken. The buildings that would have housed them were destroyed. You can't simply reverse a century and a quarter of history. What you can do is acknowledge the wrong, attempt restitution, and commit to a different kind of future. And that's what's happening now, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. Museums in Nigeria are being strengthened, partnerships are being built, scholarship is decolonizing, and the people of Benin City are reclaiming their own narrative. The bronzes returning isn't an ending, it's a beginning of a new phase in a very long story. At the same time, we're seeing how return can be more than just a transaction. Some of the Western museums that are returning bronzes are also establishing long-term partnerships with Nigerian institutions. They're providing funding for conservation training, supporting archaeological research in Benin City, collaborating on exhibitions that will travel between countries. They're recognizing that if they want to maintain any relationship with these objects, any role in studying and displaying them, they need to do so on terms of genuine equality. This is what ethical cultural exchange could look like.